There are places in this world that carry silence differently than others. Not the quiet of an empty room or still night, but the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that has been building for decades, pressing against locked doors and sealed memories. The attic at Graceland, Elvis Presley's legendary Memphis mansion, held exactly that kind of silence for 48 years. From the moment Elvis Presley drew his last breath in August of 1977, that space above the most famous home in rock and roll history remained untouched, unvisited, and deliberately forgotten. No family member went up there. No archivist catalogued what lay inside. No tour guide mentioned it to the millions of fans who walk through Graceland's doors every year. It simply existed, sealed and waiting, like a secret the house itself was keeping. Then, in early 2025, the door finally opened. What the team of archivists found inside was not what most people expected. There were no hidden escape tunnels, no evidence of a fake death, no grand conspiracy waiting to unravel. What they found was something far more powerful and far more human than any theory could have predicted. They found the private interior life of one of the most public figures who ever lived. They found the real Elvis Presley, not the rhinestone-suited performer, not the Hollywood leading man, not the caricature that decades of tabloid stories had constructed around his memory. They found a man who kept his childhood teddy bear, a man who read philosophy and underlined Bible verses, a man who recorded music alone, in the dark, with no audience and no pressure, just because the music was still alive inside him even as his body was failing. This is the story of what was hidden in Elvis Presley's attic, why it was hidden, what it reveals about the man and the myth, and why it matters even now, nearly half a century after his death. To understand why the attic mattered so much, you first have to understand what Graceland meant, and what it became after Elvis died. Elvis Aaron Presley bought the property in March of 1957. He was 22 years old, already one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, and he needed somewhere to call home that the rest of the world couldn't easily reach. The house itself was a two-story colonial revival mansion built in 1939, sitting on just under 14 acres of land on the southern edge of Memphis, Tennessee. The previous owners had named it Graceland after a family member. Elvis kept the name. He said it suited the place. In the years that followed, Elvis transformed Graceland into an extension of his personality. He installed the now famous Jungle Room, a den decorated with waterfall features and green shag carpet that climbed up the walls. He had a basement television room built with multiple screens, so he could watch several channels at once, something genuinely unusual in the 1960s. The grounds held stables, a racquetball court, and a swimming pool. The front gate was decorated with cast-iron musical notes. Everything about the place announced that someone extraordinary lived there. But Graceland was also a refuge, in a life that left Elvis very little privacy. The mansion was the one place where he could occasionally just be a person. He cooked in the kitchen at strange hours of the night. He played piano in the racquetball building while everyone else was asleep. He walked the grounds in the early morning hours when the rest of Memphis was still dreaming. The meditation garden he created in 1964, with its circular fountain, its tall white columns, and its carefully tended flower beds, was a place he returned to again and again when the noise of fame became too much to carry. When Elvis died on August 16, 1977, Graceland's identity shifted permanently. Within days, nearly 100,000 people descended on Memphis to mourn. The gates of the property became a makeshift memorial covered in flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes. Fans who had never met Elvis wept openly on the sidewalk outside. The scale of the grief was unlike anything America had seen for a private citizen. Elvis was initially buried at Forest Hill Cemetery alongside his mother, Gladys, who had died in 1958, an event that devastated Elvis so completely that people close to him said he was never quite the same afterward. But the grave at Forest Hill did not stay undisturbed for long. Just 2 days after the burial, a group of men attempted to steal Elvis's coffin in the middle of the night. They were caught before they could succeed, but the attempt rattled Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, to his core. He made the decision to have both Elvis and Gladys quietly relocated. Under cover of darkness, their remains were moved to the meditation garden at Graceland itself, the peaceful space Elvis had built as his private sanctuary. That decision changed everything. Graceland was no longer simply a home or even a memorial. It became, in a very real sense, a fortress built around the man's legacy. Vernon added security systems and guards. Certain areas of the mansion were sealed off entirely. The second floor, where Elvis's private bedroom and bathroom were located, was declared permanently off-limits, and above the second floor, the attic was locked and simply left alone. When Graceland opened to the public in 1982, following Vernon Presley's death the previous year, it quickly became one of the most visited private residences in the United States, drawing somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 visitors annually. Fans could walk through the living room with its stained-glass peacock windows. They could peer into the kitchen and the famous jungle room. They could stand quietly at Elvis's grave in the meditation garden and leave flowers or simply bow their heads. But every tour ended the same way. At the base of the staircase, there was a velvet rope. Beyond that rope was the second floor, and above it, the attic. Tour guides delivered the same explanation to every group. The upstairs was private, maintained out of respect for the Presley family. It was a perfectly reasonable answer and one that seemed to satisfy most people on its surface. But there was always a current of something unspoken running beneath that explanation. Fans who visited Graceland in large numbers were not casual observers. They had studied Elvis's life in extraordinary detail. They knew the names of his closest friends, the titles of his least-known recordings, the exact dates of his most important performances. And the longer the upstairs stayed sealed, the more their imaginations filled the space with possibilities. What was up there? Personal diaries, letters that had never been made public, evidence of something the family wanted kept hidden. The sealed attic became a kind of Rorschach test for everything people believed or suspected about Elvis, his death, and the decades of myth-making that followed. Some of the theories were straightforward. Many fans simply believed the family was protecting genuinely private material, personal correspondence, medical records, intimate photographs, the ordinary accumulations of a private life that happened to belong to one of the most famous people who ever lived. That kind of privacy was entirely understandable and deserved respect. Other theories were considerably more elaborate. The idea that Elvis had faked his own death and was still alive somewhere had circulated almost from the moment his death was announced. The theory rested on a collection of oddities: the unusual weight of his coffin, the spelling of his middle name on the gravestone as Aaron rather than the more commonly used Aaron, alleged sightings of a man resembling Elvis at airports and diners in the weeks following his death. These theories never fully disappeared. They evolved through the years, finding new life on internet forums and YouTube videos, accumulating new details and new believers with each passing decade. The sealed attic fed those theories simply by existing. If there was nothing to hide, why keep it locked? If the family had nothing to protect, why did the rope at the bottom of the stairs never come down? The answer, it turned out, was both simpler and more moving than any conspiracy theory could accommodate. For most of the 48 years that the attic remained locked, the question of who would eventually open it, and when, and under what circumstances, existed only in the abstract. Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis's only child, inherited Graceland and the Elvis Presley estate and managed both with a fierce protectiveness that extended to the sealed areas of the mansion. She knew what was in the attic. She had chosen to honor her father's apparent wish for privacy and leave it undisturbed. When Lisa Marie died in January 2023, at the age of 54, the responsibility for Graceland passed to her eldest daughter, Riley Keough. Riley, who had built a successful career as an actress, suddenly found herself the sole heir to one of the most complex and valuable estates in entertainment history. She was also, by all accounts, deeply committed to approaching that responsibility thoughtfully and carefully. Then, in the spring of 2024, an unexpected threat emerged. A company called Norsany Investments and Private Lending LLC filed legal paperwork claiming that Riley had defaulted on a loan of nearly $4 million that had been secured against Graceland itself. The company announced plans to auction the property. The claim sent shockwaves through the Elvis fan community and the broader world of American cultural heritage. Graceland, the second most visited private home in America after the White House, potentially going up for auction to satisfy a debt Riley's legal team said she had never incurred. The signatures on the loan documents, her lawyers argued when they rushed to court, were forged. The entire proceeding was fraudulent. A Tennessee judge agreed. Just one day before the scheduled auction, he issued an emergency order blocking the sale, describing Graceland as an irreplaceable cultural asset whose loss to public access would constitute genuine harm. Critically, no representative from Norsany Investments appeared in court to contest the ruling. The auction was stopped. Graceland remained in Presley hands. But the episode shook Riley deeply. The idea that Graceland, and everything it contained, could be removed from the family through fraudulent legal maneuvering, that strangers could gain access to the most private corners of her grandfather's home, prompted her to reconsider the long-standing policy of sealed silence. If the estate was going to be properly protected and its contents properly preserved, someone needed to know exactly what was there. In January 2025, Riley Keough authorized the opening of the attic. The archivists wore white cotton gloves when they climbed the narrow staircase on that cold January morning. There were 5 of them, specialists in paper conservation, audio preservation, textile care, and historical documentation. They moved slowly and methodically, understanding that they were entering a space that had been sealed since 1977. The first thing they noticed was that the attic was larger than expected. It ran the full length of the mansion's roof, a long, low space with wooden floors and plain walls. Dormer windows on either side had been covered by heavy blackout curtains at some point in the past, keeping the interior in near total darkness. A small window unit air conditioner, somehow still operational after decades of maintenance by Graceland's facilities staff, who had kept it running without ever entering the space, had maintained a relatively stable temperature throughout the years. This was fortunate. Temperature fluctuations are among the most destructive forces for paper, fabric, and magnetic tape. What struck everyone in the room almost immediately was that the attic had been organized deliberately and carefully. This was not a storage space where things had simply been thrown and forgotten. It had been arranged. Boxes lined one wall in a sequence that the archivists quickly recognized as chronological. Each box was labeled in handwriting that Graceland's records confirmed matched Elvis Presley's own. The labels read like chapters in a memoir: Tupelo, first recordings, Army, Hollywood, comeback, Vegas. And at the end of the sequence, a single box with a single word written on it, after, dated 1977. Waking with the patience and precision that their training demanded, the archivists began at the beginning. The Tupelo box held objects from Elvis's earliest years in poverty in Mississippi. There was a small, badly worn stuffed bear, missing one glass eye, its fabric faded and repaired multiple times with patches cut from what appeared to be a woman's floral print dress. Family records and accounts from Elvis's cousin confirmed this was a childhood toy Elvis had kept from his earliest years, one his mother Gladys had repaired repeatedly using fabric from her own clothing. Given the family's financial circumstances during his early childhood, particularly during the period when Vernon Presley served time in prison for check fraud, such a toy would have represented genuine comfort and security to a small child. That Elvis had kept it, had brought it to Graceland, had carefully preserved it in a sealed box for the entirety of his adult life, said something about him that no amount of stage performance ever could. The Army box contained Gladys Presley's Bible. The spine was wrapped in electrical tape, the pages dense with underlined passages and handwritten notes in the margins. Gladys had given it to Elvis when he was drafted in 1958, and he had clearly used it constantly. The notes showed a mind grappling seriously with questions of faith, mortality, and meaning. One of the last margin notes, written in August of 1977 in the days immediately before his death, was beside the 23rd Psalm. The Hollywood box revealed the tensions of fame that Elvis rarely discussed publicly. There was a leather jacket from the 1957 film Jailhouse Rock, preserved in remarkable condition, and inside one of its pockets was a folded piece of paper on which Elvis had written 4 words, "Wear this to dissipate." The books stored in the same section ranged across Eastern philosophy, comparative religion, theosophy, and metaphysics, all heavily annotated. These were not decorative volumes. They were waking texts, the reading material of someone genuinely wrestling with the largest questions available to human thought. The Vegas box contained, among other things, a sealed medical report dated 1974 and marked confidential. The archivists photographed the exterior of the document and noted it in their inventory, but did not break the seal, which remains under review by the Presley estate. The cover page referenced cardiac concerns and significant recommended lifestyle modifications. Elvis performed for 3 more years after this report was written. Perhaps the most electrifying discovery was a collection of reel-to-reel audio tapes stored in a flat wooden case near the back wall of the attic. The tapes were labeled in Elvis's handwriting as private practice sessions from 1976. They had never been duplicated, catalogued, or heard by anyone outside the room where they were recorded. Audio preservation specialists spent several days assessing the condition of the tapes before attempting playback. Magnetic tape from this era is susceptible to a condition called stickershed syndrome, caused by the breakdown of the binder that holds the magnetic particles to the tape backing. Attempting to play a tape in this condition without proper treatment can destroy it permanently. The specialists used a controlled baking process to temporarily stabilize the tapes before making careful transfers to digital format. What came through was extraordinary. These were not polished recordings. They were private, exploratory sessions in which Elvis was clearly working through ideas with no intention of sharing them. He moved between gospel, traditional blues, and something that drew from the electronic and experimental sounds that were becoming prominent in popular music in the mid-1970s. He stopped frequently, rewound, tried passages differently. At one point, he could be heard simply speaking to himself, muttering about what a particular chord progression needed. But then there was the recording that stopped everyone in the room. It was a version of Unchained Melody, the song originally written in 1955 and recorded by numerous artists over the decades. Elvis had performed it in his later years as part of his live concerts, and a version recorded during a 1977 concert was released posthumously, becoming one of his most celebrated recordings. But this attic version was something different entirely. It was recorded with no backing track, no instrumentation of any kind, just his voice, alone, in a room, singing a song about longing in time and the fear of being forgotten. His voice on this recording is not the powerful instrument of his prime. It is thinner, more fragile, occasionally uncertain in its pitch. And yet, according to the musicologists who later analyzed the recording, that fragility was precisely what made it devastating. Every technical imperfection in the performance became a form of emotional information. You could hear in this voice a man who understood, at some level, that he was running out of time. The recording was made in late 1976 or early 1977, months before his death. Among the most unexpectedly moving discoveries in the attic was a collection of fan mail, still sealed in its original envelopes, that had apparently been set aside and never opened. There were hundreds of letters, postmarked across a range of years but concentrated heavily in the mid-1970s. The decision to open them was not taken lightly. The archivists consulted with the Presley estate before proceeding, and a representative of the family was present when the envelopes were carefully unsealed and their contents transcribed. The letters were from ordinary people. A soldier stationed overseas who wrote that Elvis's recordings had kept him sane during months away from his family. A woman in rural Alabama who described how a particular song had helped her through the death of her child. A young musician from Ohio asking for any advice Elvis might have about pursuing a career in music. Dozens of letters from fans simply expressing gratitude for what his music had given them. One letter, postmarked 1976 and written by a woman who identified herself as a nurse, gently and directly urged Elvis to take better care of himself. She had read the news coverage of his health struggles and his weight gain and his erratic performances. She wrote that she was worried about him. She told him that whatever was happening in his life, there were people who would rather have him alive and well and silent than performing while he was suffering. She told him he had earned the right to rest. The envelope had never been opened. There is no way to know whether reading that letter might have changed anything. The forces shaping Elvis's final years were vast and complex, involving his own psychology, his physical health, the medical practices of his doctors, and the enormous financial machinery that depended on him continuing to perform. A single letter could not have dismantled all of that. But the letter sitting sealed in an attic box for nearly 50 years is its own kind of testimony about the gap that can exist between what someone needs to hear and what actually reaches them. There's a version of Elvis Presley's story that most people know reasonably well. The poor boy from Tupelo who changed American music forever. The young man who was simultaneously thrilling and threatening to mainstream white America in the 1950s. The Hollywood actor who made too many movies and not enough meaningful recordings. The Las Vegas performer who returned to live performance in 1968 in a leather suit and reminded the world what he was capable of, and then spent the next 9 years slowly, publicly, and tragically diminishing. That story is true. All of it happened. The tragedy of Elvis's final years is real and worth reckoning with honestly. He was failed by people who prioritized his commercial value over his health. He was surrounded by enablers when he needed people willing to tell him hard truths. He died at 42 when he should have had decades left. But the attic told a different story alongside that one. Not a contradictory story, but a parallel one. It told the story of a man who never stopped thinking, never stopped questioning, never stopped searching. The philosophy books with their crowded margins, the Bible with its decades of careful notes, the music he made in private that no one was ever supposed to hear, the childhood toy he carried with him from Mississippi to Memphis and kept for the rest of his life. This was not the Elvis of legend. This was something more interesting, more complicated, and ultimately more admirable. A man of genuine intellectual curiosity, who had never been given the educational opportunities to fully develop it. A man of deep spiritual longing who could never quite find the framework that satisfied him. A man who, even in the depths of his physical decline, was still exploring musical ideas that no one around him was pushing him toward. Riley Keough has said that she decided to open the attic not to expose her grandfather but to protect him, to ensure that the complete picture of who he was would be preserved properly and not lost to time or accident. The materials discovered there will be carefully catalogued and stored under professional archival conditions. Some will eventually become part of the public record. Some may remain private indefinitely. But the act of opening the door, of finally letting light into a space that had been sealed for 48 years, was itself a kind of statement. It said that the real Elvis Presley, not the myth, not the conspiracy, not the caricature, but the actual human being who lived and struggled and created and suffered in that house, deserved to be seen. There is something profound about the fact that the most revealing evidence of who Elvis Presley truly was had been sitting above the heads of millions of visitors for nearly half a century. While people stood in the jungle room or the television den and constructed their understanding of him from the bold, theatrical artifacts of his public life, the real man was preserved in plain wooden boxes just a staircase away. The childhood bear, the annotated Bible, the private recordings made in solitude, the letters he set aside and never quite got around to opening. Graceland has always been described as a place where time stopped on August 16, 1977. But the attic suggests something different. It suggests that Elvis himself understood, at some level, that time was running out, and he spent what remained of it organizing the evidence of a life that was far richer and far stranger and far more searching than the world had been allowed to see. The door is open now. The silence has finally ended, and what it was protecting turns out to have been worth the wait. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves Elvis Presley. There's always more to discover.